Fireside Tales for Wolfgang, episode 52. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. I thought I'd open this evening with a Walt Whitman poem. It just seemed extremely relevant. This poem actually made its way into the Netflix show Breaking Bad. If you have not seen Breaking Bad, it's pretty brilliant. I gotta say, it is some of the writing, some of the characters have such incredible depth that there's this whole there's a side character who very much like worships and idolizes Walter White, who does crime under the pseudonym of Heisenberg. And this side character is particularly enamored with Walt Whitman, and so compares Walter White to Walt Whitman, and the matched up initials Walter White and Walt Whitman is also used. But this poem factors into a plot. And this poem is by Walt Whitman. It is called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became sick and tired, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Damn, I love that poem. That Walt Whitman's got a lot of classics, but that is one of my favorites. Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T Uverse Channel 99. This poem is called I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong, the carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work, the boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck, the shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning or at noon intermission or at sundown, the delicious singing of the mother or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. I've read some short stories by Kate Chopin before. She was a brilliant writer. I'll give you a little bio of Kate before this first short story. Kate Chopin began to meet with resistance from American editors to the themes in her stories, especially to what has been called her subversive streak. Her tales were increasingly influenced by her reading of the French author Guy de Maupassant. Guy de Maupassant. That's it. The influence of de Maupassant's stories on Chopin's writing is substantial, particularly their emphasis on psychological character development. The mammoth Oxford Book of Women's Writing in the United States avers that her accurate portrayals of Victorian and turn-of-the-century women have never been equaled for the depiction of women's interior conflicts. So, acknowledged for her depth. And like de Maupassant, Chopin often employed a surprise or disconcerting ending. Yet Maupassant's naturalism had a reputation among American readers for being racy, and the earthy and sensual elements that found their way into Chopin's prose made her editors nervous. Kate Chopin found a home for her short fiction at Vogue, which would publish 19 of her stories during the 1890s. Silk stockings. A pair of silk stockings is one of the subversive selections that would end up in Vogue and is still one of her most read stories. At least one critic avows that this story is one of Chopin's best stories and is one of the best pieces in turn-of-the-century American literature by anyone. Again, high praise by people who appreciated her. Anyone within the sound of my voice is urged to consider the larger meaning of this brief account of a single day of the protagonist Miss Summer's life. A Pair of Silk Stockings is not only a story about a particular woman who is economically on the margins of society, but this is also a story of that entire society. A society caught between traditional ideas of feminine roles and the then newly emergent American culture of consumption, unquote. This story is called A Pair of Silk Stockings. It originally appeared in Vogue on September 16th, 1897, by Kate Chopin. Little Miss Summers one day found herself with the unexpected possession of $15. It seemed to her a very large amount of money, and the way in which it stuffed and bulged her worn-out wallet gave her a feeling of importance that she had not enjoyed for years. The question of investment was one that occupied her greatly. For a day or two, she walked about, apparently in a dreamy state, but really absorbed in speculation and calculation. She did not wish to act hastily or to do anything she might afterward regret, but it was during the still hours of the night, when she lay awake, revolving plans in her mind, that she seemed to see her way clearly toward a proper and judicious use of the money. $1 or $2 should be added to the price usually paid for Janie's shoes, which would ensure their lasting an appreciable time longer than they usually did. She would buy many yards of percale for the new shirts for the boys and Janie and Meg. She had intended to make the old ones do by skillful patching. Meg should have another gown. She had seen some beautiful patterns, veritable bargains in the shop windows, and still there would be left enough for new stockings, 2 pair apiece. And what darning that would save for a while. She would get caps for the boys and sailor hats for the girls. The vision of her little brood looking fresh and dainty and new for once in their lives excited her and made her restless and wakeful with anticipation. The neighbors sometimes talked of certain better days that little Miss Summers had known before she had ever thought of being Mrs. Summers. She herself indulged in no such morbid retrospection. She had no time to devote to the past. The needs of the present absorbed her every faculty. A vision of the future, like some dim, gaunt monster, sometimes appalled her. But luckily, tomorrow never comes. Wow, that's a great line. Mrs. Summers was one who knew the value of bargains, who could stand for hours making her way inch by inch toward the desired object that was selling below cost. She could elbow her way if need be. She had learned to clutch a piece of goods and hold it and stick to it with persistence and determination until her turn came to be served, no matter when it came. But that day, she was a little faint and tired. She had eaten a light luncheon. No, when she came to think of it, between getting the children fed and the place righted and preparing herself for shopping, she had actually forgotten to eat any luncheon at all. She sat herself upon a revolving stool before a counter that was comparatively deserted, trying to gather strength and courage to charge through an eager multitude. A limp feeling had come over her, and she rested her hand aimlessly upon the counter. She wore no gloves. By degrees, she grew aware that her hand had encountered something very soothing, very pleasant to touch. She looked down to see that her hand lay upon a pile of silk stockings. A placard nearby announced that they had been reduced in price from $2.50 to $1.98. And a young girl who stood behind the counter asked her if she wished to examine their line of silk hosiery. She smiled, just as if she had been asked to inspect a tiara of diamonds with the ultimate view of purchasing it. But she went on feeling the soft, sheeny, luxurious things with both hands now, holding them up to see them glisten and to feel them glide smoothly through her fingers. 2 hectic blotches came suddenly into her pale cheeks. She looked up at the girl. "Do you think there are any 8.5 among these?" There were any number of 8.5. In fact, there were more of that size than any other. Here was a light blue pair, and there's some lavender, some all black, and various shades of tan and gray. Mrs. Summers selected a black pair and looked at them very long and closely. She pretended to be examining their texture, which the clerk assured her was excellent. $1.98, she mused aloud. Well, I'll take this pair. She handed the girl a $5 bill and waited for her change and for her parcel. What a very small parcel it was. It seemed lost in the depths of her shabby old shopping bag. After that, Mrs. Summers did not move in the direction of the bargain counter. She took the elevator, which carried her to an upper floor into the region of the ladies' waiting rooms. Here, in a retired corner, she exchanged her cotton stockings for the new silk ones which she had just bought. She was not going through any acute mental process or reasoning with herself, nor was she striving to explain to her satisfaction the motive of her action. She was not thinking at all. She seemed, for the time, to be taking a rest from that laborious and fatiguing function, and to have abandoned herself to some mechanical impulse that directed her actions and freed her of her responsibility. How good was the touch of the raw silk to her skin. She felt like lying back in the cushioned chair and reveling for a while in the luxury of it. She did for a little while. Then she replaced her shoes, rolled the cotton stockings together, and thrust them into her bag. After doing this, she crossed straight over to the shoe department and took her seat to be fitted. She was fastidious. The clerk could not make her out. He could not reconcile her shoes with her stockings, and she was not too easily pleased. She held back her skirts and turned her feet one way and then another way as she looked down at the polished, pointed-tipped boots. Her foot and ankle looked very pretty. She could not realize that they belonged to her and were a part of herself. She told the young fellow who served her that she wanted an excellent and stylish fit, and she did not mind the difference of $1 or $2 more in the price so long as she got what she desired. It was a long time since Mrs. Summers had been fitted with gloves. On rare occasions, when she had bought a pair, they were always bargains, so cheap it would have been preposterous and unreasonable to have expected them to be fitted to the hand. Now, she rested her elbow on the cushion of the glove counter, and a pretty, pleasant young creature, delicate and deft of touch, drew a long-wristed, soft leather glove over Mrs. Summers' hand. She smoothed it down over the wrist and buttoned it neatly, and both lost themselves for a second or two in admiring contemplation of the little symmetrical gloved hand. But there were other places where money might be spent. There were books and magazines piled up in the window of a stall a few places down the street. Mrs. Summers bought 2 high-priced magazines, such as she had been accustomed to read in the days when she had been accustomed to other pleasant things. She carried them without wrapping. As well as she could, she lifted her skirts at the crossings. Her stockings and boots and properly fitted gloves had worked marvels in her bearing and had given her a feeling of assurance, a sense of belonging to the well-dressed multitude. She was very hungry. Another time, she would have stilled the cravings for food until reaching her own home, where she would have brewed herself a cup of tea and taken a snack of anything that was available. But the impulse that was guiding her would not suffer her to entertain any such thought. There was a restaurant at the corner. She had never entered its doors. From the outside, she had sometimes caught glimpses of spotless damask and shining crystal and soft-stepping waiters serving people of fashion. When she entered, her appearance created no surprise, no consternation, as she had half feared it might. She seated herself at a small table alone, and an attentive waiter at once approached to take her order. She did not want a profusion. She craved a nice and tasty bite, a half-dozen blue points, a plump chop with cress, something sweet, a creme frappé, for instance, a glass of Rhine wine, and, after all, a small cup of black coffee. While waiting to be served, She removed her gloves very leisurely and laid them beside her. Then she picked up a magazine and glanced through it. It was all very agreeable. The damask was even more spotless than it had seemed through the window, and the crystal more sparkling. There were quiet ladies and gentlemen who did not notice her, lunching at small tables similar to her own. A soft, pleasing strain of music could be heard, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the window. She tasted a bite, and she read a word or two, and she sipped the amber wine and wiggled her toes in the silk stockings. The price of it made no difference. She counted the money out to the waiter and left an extra coin on his tray, whereupon he bowed before her as before a princess of royal blood. There was still money in her purse, and her next temptation presented itself in the shape of a matinee poster. It was a little later when she entered the theater. The play had begun, and the house seemed to her to be packed, but there were vacant seats here and there, and into one of them she was ushered, between brilliantly dressed women who had gone there to kill time and eat candy and display their gaudy attire. There were many others who were there solely for the play and the acting. It is safe to say there was no one present who bore quite the attitude which Mrs. Summers did to her surroundings. She gathered in the whole, stage and players and people, in one wide impression and absorbed it and enjoyed it. She laughed at the comedy and wept. She and the gaudy woman next to her wept over the tragedy, and they talked a little together over it. And the gaudy woman wiped her eyes and sniffled on a tiny square of filmy, perfumed lace and passed little Mrs. Summers her box of candy. The play was over. The music ceased. The crowd filed out. It was like a dream ended. People scattered in all directions. Mrs. Summers went to the corner and waited for the cable car. A man with keen eyes who sat opposite to her seemed to like the study of her small, pale face. It puzzled him to decipher what he saw there. In truth, he saw nothing unless he were wizard enough to detect a poignant wish, a powerful longing that the cable car would never stop anywhere, but go on and on with her forever. Clearly, Mrs. Summers loves her children very, very, very much. Her first thoughts, if you think about it, her first thoughts were how to spend the money really well to provide for their needs. And it's pretty clear, though, that she just had a simple desire for an escape from the cares of life that come especially from not having enough money. She simply would like an escape to life, even a temporary one, where she could have what she wants, do what she wants, not be in a constant state of having so few pleasures of her own. This kind of escapism is a pretty important part of Kate Chopin's themes. It's why so many people, especially women of her time, could relate to her stories. She wrote about people's internal experiences that usually could not be voiced in public. Okay, this one is called A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider. I marked where, on a little promontory, it stood isolated. Marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, oh my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached, and measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling, catch somewhere. Oh, my soul. Wow. So this poem is an epically long poem. So what I'm going to do here is just read the first and last stanzas. It's the first and the 52nd stanza to give you an idea of how long this thing is. The first and last stanzas serve as being the outer frame wherein lies his detailed explanation in all of the other stanzas of how we individually, and his examples are many, are all a part of one another, of how we are individuals who form a collective of sacredly beautiful oneness. There are three important themes: the idea of the self, the identification of the self with other selves, and the poet's relationship with the elements of nature and the universe. There's a line in here, I loaf and invite my soul. This perfectly reflects Whitman's sensibilities. On the one hand, it suggests a languorous sensuality, while on the other hand, his loafing can be understood as spiritual rest, the stillness that genuinely invites the sacred experience. Without further ado, this is the first and 52nd stanza of the 1892 version of a poem called Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. I celebrate myself and sing myself and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I, too, am not a bit tamed. I, too, am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the rooftops of the world. The last scud of day holds back from me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed wilds, it coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. But you will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing one piece, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. Here is another much shorter short story by Kate Chopin. Now, this one, I've got to tell you, was so controversial in her day, it wasn't published. I mean, this is just, I really want you to hear that first. Some of Chopin's pieces of short fiction were considered too hot for publication in national magazines. And the thing I'm about to read, called Fedora, which is interesting because it's a female protagonist, and her name is what I consider a very manly looking hat, Fedora. Fedora was unpublished at the time of Kate Chopin's death. When she finished the story in 1896, she was at the peak of her fame. Her writing regularly appeared in many major national magazines. We can guess, when you get to the end, we can easily guess why this particular work was rejected by editors. Her biography, Emily Toth, says, Chopin gave Fedora a twist, and one that made it hard to publish. I think that twist is going to be very obvious given that context now. So, written in 1896 by Kate Chopin, the story is called Fedora. Fedora had determined, upon driving over to the station, herself for Miss Malthers. Though one or two of them looked disappointed, notably her brother, no one opposed her. She said the brute was restive and shouldn't be trusted to the handling of the young people. To be sure, Fedora was old enough, from the standpoint of her sister Camilla and the rest of them. Yet no one would ever have thought of it but for her own persistent affectation and idiotic assumption of superior years and wisdom. She was 30. Fedora had, too early in life, formed an ideal and treasured it. By this ideal, she had measured such male beings as had hitherto challenged her attention, and needless to say, she had found them wanting. The young people, her brothers and sisters' guests, who were constantly coming and going that summer, occupied her to a great extent, but failed to interest her. She concerned herself with their comforts in the absence of her mother, looked after their health and well-being, contrived for their amusements in which she never joined. And as Fedora was tall and slim and carried her head loftily and wore eyeglasses and a severe expression, some of them, the silliest, felt as if she were 100 years old. Young Malthers thought she was about 40. One day, when he stopped before her out in the gravel to ask her some question pertaining to the afternoon's sport, Fedora, who was tall, had to look up into his face to answer him. She had known him 8 years, since he was a lad of 15, and to her, he had never been other than the lad of 15. But that afternoon, looking up into his face, the sudden realization came home to her that he was a man. In voice, in attitude, in bearing, in every sense, a man. In an absorbing glance and with unaccountable attention, she gathered in every detail of his countenance as though it were a strange, new thing to her, presenting itself to her vision for the first time. The eyes were blue, earnest, and at the moment, a little troubled over some trivial affair that he was relating to her. The face was brown from the sun, smooth, with no suggestion of ruddiness except in the lips that were strong, firm, clean. She kept thinking of his face and every trick of it after he passed on. From that moment, he began to exist for her. She looked at him when he was nearby. She listened for his voice and took notice and account of what he said. She sought him out. She selected him when occasion permitted. She wanted him by her, though his nearness troubled her. There was uneasiness, restlessness, expectation when he was not within sight or sound. There was redoubled uneasiness when he was by. There was inward revolt, astonishment, rapture, self-contumely, a swift, fierce encounter betwixt thought and feeling. Fedora could hardly explain to her own satisfaction why she wanted to go herself to the station for young Malther's sister. She felt a desire to see the girl, to be near her, as unaccountable when she tried to analyze it as the impulse which drove her, and to which she often yielded, to touch his hat, hanging with others upon the hall pegs when she passed it by. Once, a coat which he had discarded hung there too. She handled it under pretense of putting it in order. There was no one near, and, obeying a sudden impulse, she buried her face for an instant in the rough folds of the coat. Fedora reached the station a little before the train time. It was in a pretty nook, green and fragrant, set down at the foot of a wooded hill. Off in a clearing there was a field of yellow grain, upon which the sinking sunlight fell in slanting, broken beams. Far down the track there were some men at work, and even the ring of their hammers was the only sound that broke upon the stillness. Fedora loved it all. Sky and woods and sunlight, sounds and smells, but her bearing, elegant, composed, reserved, betrayed nothing emotional as she tramped the narrow platform, whip in hand, and occasionally offered a condescending word to the mailman or the sleepy agent. Malther's sister was the only soul to disembark from the train. Fedora had never seen her before, but if there had been 100, she would have known the girl. She was a small thing, but aside from that, there was the coloring. There were the blue, earnest eyes. There, above all, was the firm, full curve of the lips, the same setting of the white, even teeth. There was the subtle play of feature, the elusive trick of expression, which she had thought peculiar and individual in the one, presenting themselves as family traits. The suggestive resemblance of the girl to her brother was vivid, poignant, even to Fedora, realizing, as she did with a pang, that familiarity and custom would soon blur the image. Little Miss Maulders was a quiet, reserved creature with little to say. She had been to college with Camilla and spoke somewhat of their friendship and former closeness. She sat lower in the cart than Fedora, who drove, handling whip and rein with accomplished skill. "You know, dear child," said Fedora in her usual elderly fashion, "I want you to feel completely at home with us." They were driving through a long, quiet, leafy road into which the twilight was just beginning to creep. "Come to me freely and without reserve, with all your wants, with any complaints. I feel that I shall be quite fond of you." She had gathered the reins into one hand, and with the other free arm she encircled Miss Maulders' shoulders. When the girl looked up into her face with murmured thanks, Fedora bent down and pressed a long, penetrating kiss upon her mouth. Maulders' sister appeared astonished and not too well pleased. Fedora, with seemingly unruffled composure, gathered the reins, and for the rest of the way stared steadily ahead of her between the horse's ears. Yeah. So, she was 30 and unmarried as one of the premises. We find out that she's probably only really noticed one man, one dude in her life, and seems to be more into his sister. But you could not write a protagonist like that with that sort of internal conflict. Not in 1896, you couldn't. And now for Ask Hunter Anything, where I answer questions submitted by you, the viewers. Please know that these episodes are live streamed on the Hunter's Acoustic Cabin YouTube channel every Monday evening at 9 o'clock California time, before they're made into this broadcast version. So you may hear reference to those who chat with me during my answers. And hey, if you have a question that you would like answered on Fireside Tailes for Wolfgang, email me using the email address AskHunterAnything@gmail.com. It's just a life's hobby, passion, ambition, whatever you want to call it, of mine. I'm just a really big fan of really good questions. Spent my entire life cultivating the best questions that I could possibly find. And I'd like to hear what questions that you have that you would put into that category. I had two parallel questions, or rather I should say two related questions this evening. The first one comes from Maggie from Pasadena. Maggie says, I have a question about the JWST. You said that it has an onboard fuel tank. It's used so little fuel so far that we now have 10 years instead of 5 years to look forward to the studies from this telescope. So, how does the fuel do the James Webb Space Telescope any good? I mean, there's nothing in space for thrusters or whatever to push off of. So how does any fuel do anything for the JWST? You said the fuel is used for course correcting, but I don't understand how even that happens. Well, Maggie, thank you for the question. Okay, so I'll explain it this way. This is how just kind of any rocket thruster in space is going to work, or any rocket thruster anywhere, really. This is like above the surface of the Earth, just in the air. This is how it would work here, too. So when I was a little kid, I remember standing up in the grocery cart when I was at National with my mom, and noticing how the cart kind of moves underneath me, right? If you were to like pick up something like a watermelon while standing in a grocery cart, and you were to say, throw the watermelon forward in the grocery cart, well, you in the grocery cart would roll backwards. That's conservation of momentum. Having thrusters on the side of a ship or on the back of the ship, having thrusters on any part of the ship is, in this case, just like having a person strapped to the outside of that space vehicle, a person with, say, a 20-pound bowling ball. And if the person were strapped to the outside of the James Webb Space Telescope here and were to throw a 20-pound bowling ball, well, the person and the James Webb Space Telescope would move in the opposite direction, just a little bit opposite to the direction that the bowling ball was thrown. Throw something heavier than a bowling ball, and you're going to have a resultant opposite motion that is slightly faster, is slightly more. Throw the same 20-pound bowling ball simply faster, and the same result is going to happen. You're going to have opposite motion. There's this phrase in basic physics, equal and opposite. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That's exactly, this is exactly the scenario that that's referring to. So when you're burning a rocket thruster on a space vehicle, essentially, if the burn of the thruster is going backward or toward the bottom of the vehicle is going to go in the opposite direction for the exact same reasons that it doesn't even matter in this case that you're burning fuel and throwing hot stuff out the back. It's just really the fact that you're throwing stuff out the back. And the James Webb Space Telescope has little corrective thrusters all around it, so it can sort of re-steer, if you will. And that'll help with course correction. And the James Webb Space Telescope is going to need fuel to power those thrusters for the next 10 years to keep it where it is going to be in space relative to the Earth and the Sun, which is this gravitationally stable area, reasonably stable, called the Lagrange point 2. I compared it before to a Lagrange point is kind of like being on the flat spot of the top or the bottom of a hill versus being on the slope of a hill. And so you can imagine if the James Webb Space Telescope were a ball on the top of an actual hill here on the Earth, that it doesn't take a lot of correction to keep it generally on top. Like if a great wind comes along and starts to blow it down the hill, okay, it's got thrusters to put itself right back in the middle of the hill. So that's what we need those thrusters for. And the initial launch of the telescope was so accurate, we used so little fuel getting it to where it needs to be, where it is 80% of the way to, that it's got so much fuel in reserve. We were hoping to have at least 5 years with this thing, and now we're going to have over 10 years with this thing. So that is a very big deal. All the stuff that we're going to be able to use this to look at while it still has fuel left. And another Ask Hunter Anything question. Remember, you can submit your questions too by using the email address AskHunterAnything@gmail.com. On one of Neil deGrasse Tyson's shows, when he was talking about JWST, he said that we have never had a telescope that could see infrared before, and that's why this telescope is so very important. Okay, we'll come back to that point. I don't think that's actually correct, but we'll come back to that. I'm going to read the whole question. You were talking about the heat and how JWST can detect heat. So that's the same thing. But you might bring those two terms together somehow when you're talking about JWST. I know you've also mentioned how it sees infrared light, and that's why JWST is important. But I don't think you have said how we've never had a telescope that can see in infrared before. Okay, so no, we've had several infrared space. We've had several infrared telescopes, and we've even had a couple of infrared space telescopes before. So I'd have to hear Professor Tyson's podcast specifically to know what the misunderstanding was. He might have said something to the effect of, we've never had an infrared telescope this big. He may have said, we have never had an infrared space telescope that will be in service, in operation, for as long as this one will be. I could see him having said either of those two. But this isn't even the first space telescope that we've put at Lagrange Point 2. The Herschel Space Observatory had infrared capability, and that was up there for, 4 years off the top of my head? 5 years, something like that. The Spitzer Space Telescope also... Planck! No. I can't remember where Spitzer was. Spitzer might have been in L2, but the Planck telescope was also at L2. And here's another one. The different telescopes, not just space telescopes, different telescopes are geared more and less toward different wavelengths of light, just depending on their design. Anything that we call visible light, we'll say, is in a sort of a middle wavelength of light. Things that happen toward the blue end of what we call visible light go toward the shorter wavelengths. Things that things that are redder are longer wavelengths. So anything that goes toward blue, anything that is bluer than human eyes can see, we call that ultraviolet. It's more violet than violet, if you follow. And similarly, things that are redder than what human eyes can see as red, we call that infrared. There are several creatures in nature that have evolved different kinds of eyes that can see in infrared. Pit vipers, for example. Pit vipers have... I think it's fair in the context of this conversation to say that pit vipers have 4 eyes. They've got 2 regular visual eyes that largely take in what humans call visible light spectrum, and then they've got these other 2 eyes that go in these little pits on their skull. Kind of between their actual eyeballs and their nose, that just detects heat in a visual way. They can see heat in the same way that you can reach out with your hand and put your hand next to a fire or close to a stove without burning yourself. You can feel heat emanating off. Pit vipers can see heat emanating off whatever it is they're trying to focus on. And they are detecting infrared light. They are seeing heat as light. And the reason that the James Webb Space Telescope is specifically geared in that direction is because we're going to be able to see all kinds of heat, all kinds of infrared wavelengths that will be able to just plow through dust and gas and debris in space. So dust normally, we were talking about a few weeks ago, is why is the sky blue? That was the question that was submitted. The blue wavelengths of light are so small that they can be scattered by just little tiny things like air molecules. It takes much larger particles of various forms to scatter the longer wavelengths of light. Well, things like dust in space can scatter or block all of the visible light completely. However, infrared, longer wavelengths are going to penetrate a lot of those dust clouds the same way that your neighbor's bass penetrates your walls. The same way that if you hear like male and female arguing in the apartment next to you, and you can't really make out anything that either one of them is saying specifically, but you can hear the man's voice, the more. That's because the low tones, the longer wavelengths of sound are passing through the walls much more successfully than the shorter wavelengths of sound. And that's what's going on with the James Webb Space Telescope. The longer wavelengths of infrared light are going to pass through dust clouds. And we're just going to be able to see a lot more with this thing than we could see with the Hubble. The Hubble does have infrared gear on it, but it's primarily geared toward seeing what we, again, humanly call visible wavelengths of light. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales for Wolfgang. You can view more of my work at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Produced by GWC Productions. In memory of Wolfgang Beastly. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, Caps Media Television Channel 6 in Ventura on KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Episodes can also be viewed on Pasadena Media, either on Spectrum Charter Channel 32 or on AT&T UVerse Channel 99.